Okay, so where we are right now is we are continuing on with a theme that Madison was talking about last week, which was looking at the, well, let's actually go back and look. So that was in 41. Back in 41, he said that he was going to address, I said Madison, right? Not Hamilton. Madison. Uh, what Constitution proposed by the convention may be considered under two general points of view. The first relates to the sum or quantity of power which it vests in the government, including the restraints imposed on the states, and the second to the particular structure of the government and the distribution of this power among its several branches. And then the first part is where we are right now. Under the first view of the subject, two important questions arise: whether any part of the powers transferred to the general government be unnecessary or improper, and whether the entire mass of them be dangerous to the portion of jurisdiction left to the several states. Last week and this week, we are in this part here, which is the power being given to the federal government too much? Does the Constitution proposed that came out of Philadelphia, does it go too far in giving power to the federal government? So he dealt with a whole range of issues, and what he's doing is he's pulling out clauses from the proposed Constitution, or what later became the actual Constitution. He's pulling out clauses, and he's looking at each one by one and saying, here's a power that the Constitution gives the federal government. This is why that's justified in giving it this power. And he's going through there's a bunch of these in number 41, a bunch of these in number 42. And then today we're in Federalist 43 and Federalist 44. He's going to go through some more. And then next week, he'll get to this part, whether the entire mass of them be dangerous to the portion of jurisdiction left. In other words, does the federal government encroach too far on states' rights, essentially? And then after that, further on in later weeks, we'll get to this whole issue that he mentions here about the distribution of power among the branches of the federal government, the separation of powers. Where's the bearded guy? He was cool. I'm the sub. Late modernist. Yeah. Late modernist. I've gone full postmodernist. This was something I proposed on Patreon to the folks on Patreon, most of whom don't watch the stream, I don't think, but they said do it, so I had to do it. All right, so tonight we're in 43. So let's start with 43. All right, so he's continuing on with the theme of, does the Constitution give the federal government too much power? And of course, Madison says no, or Publius says no, and he's going to go through a bunch of different clauses. All right, so starting here, the fourth class comprises the following miscellaneous powers: a power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited time to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. In other words, one of the powers given to the federal government is the power to issue patents and do copyright and stuff like that. Wait, is it? Yeah, authors, that would be copyright, and then inventors would be patents. The utility of this power will scarcely be questioned. The copyright of authors has been solemnly adjudged in Great Britain to be a right at common law. The right to useful inventions seems with equal reason to belong to the inventors. The public good fully coincides in both cases with the claims of individuals. The states cannot separately make effective provision for either of the cases, and most of them have anticipated the decision at this point by laws passed at the instance of Congress. Number 2, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such districts not exceeding 10 miles square as may be he's quoting from the Constitution. Constitution's describing what would later be known as the District of Columbia, but it had not been named yet. To exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of the government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the states, in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings. So the future District of Columbia, and also other federal facilities like forts and arsenals and stuff. At this stage, this is early 1788, nobody knew where that federal district would be located. They had not yet decided on that. That was something that was a matter for Congress to decide, as well as it says right here. The Constitution gave Congress the power to do this, to set up the federal district, to decide where it would be located, and gave instructions to Congress that it will be 10 miles square, which, well, I guess not exceeding 10 miles square. And they figured it out a couple years later. They decided on putting it on the Potomac River, and that's that's where DC comes from. That's why we have DC now, and why it's located on the Potomac. But at this time, there was a lot of talk about putting it elsewhere, like putting it in Pennsylvania or Maryland, or somewhere around there. The middle colonies, the middle states was mainly where they were thinking about putting it. The Potomac was pretty much the farthest south that was considered reasonable and acceptable for it to be located. In between two big states would make sense. Yeah, it would, but they weren't even talking about putting it between two states. It ended up being between two states, but I mean, they were talking about putting it, like there were different locations in Pennsylvania that would have effectively had it be located within Pennsylvania, so they would have just carved out a square. Pennsylvania would have had a little square-shaped hole in it. They were talking about putting it somewhere along the Susquehanna River, is the one that flows through kind of the middle of Pennsylvania. They were talking about putting it along there. It ended up being on the Potomac for a couple different reasons, but the fact that it was on a state boundary, yeah, I don't think they were really, as far as I know, I don't think people considered it really important that it be in between two states, as far as instead of being surrounded by one state. It'd be pretty weird, obviously. Like, it'd be weird, but it'd be weird in the same way that Canberra, like the Australian Capital Territory, the ACT, like that's just like an enclave. There's a little hole in New South Wales where they put the Capital Territory. That's what we would have had, basically. Now, of course, nowadays, people don't, like the reasons. Oh, he's actually going to talk about the reasons. I guess I should talk. Let me read some more of what he says, and then I'll expound on that. That western Kaliningrad-esque piece of Connecticut looks like a good place for a capital. That would have been a good, since they were expanding westward, that would have been a good place for it, actually. Only it would have been a real pain for anybody to get to in the 1790s. But yeah, like thinking long term, because now we have a capital way over on the eastern side of the country, and the country extends all the way to the Pacific. That was unanticipated. It's kind of like Tallahassee, like Florida. Tallahassee, the capital of Florida, was centrally located at the time, 200 years ago. Now it's not centrally located at all. Yeah, right. But crossing the mountains was especially. But I take your point. Everywhere was hard to get to. That's true. All right. So what does he say about this clause? The indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. And what I find striking about this paragraph from Addison is how probably only a minority of Americans today would feel the way he's saying stuff that he feels is kind of obvious, and a lot of Americans at the time would have agreed with him, and nowadays I'm not sure if a lot of Americans would agree with him. Some would. But anyway, the indispensable necessity of complete authority at the seat of government carries its own evidence with it. It is a power exercised by every legislature of the Union, I might say of the world, by virtue of its general supremacy. Without it, not only the public authority might be insulted, and its proceedings be interrupted with impunity, but a dependence of the members of the general government on the state, comprehending the seat of the government, for protection in the exercise of their duty, might bring on the national councils an imputation of awe or influence equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the other members of the Confederacy. So, just to pause here, so he's saying it would be like it would be unfair for one of the states to host the federal capital on a permanent basis. Obviously, a couple states hosted the federal capital on a temporary basis until the district was set up, but on a permanent basis, Madison's saying it would be unfair for any one state to be in that position because that state might use that fact to manipulate the federal government and to get special treatment. And the federal government would be dependent on that state for protection in the exercise of their duty, which would not be the case today. If the federal government today were in a state, it would not depend on the host state for protection. The federal government has way more military power than any state has today, but the reverse was true back then. And then here the state might exert too much influence, awe or influence upon the government that would be dissatisfactory to the other states in the Union. This consideration has the more weight as the gradual accumulation of public improvements at the stationary residence of the government would be both too great a public pledge to be left in the hands of a single state, and would create so many obstacles to a removal of the government as still further to abridge its necessary independence. So as the government built up its buildings, all its office buildings and Capitol building and everything, that would make it too prohibitive for it to relocate if it needed to move out of that state and get to a different state that would be less domineering. The extent of this federal district is sufficiently circumscribed to satisfy every jealousy of an opposite nature. In other words, the 10 miles by 10 miles. And as it is to be appropriated to its use with the consent of the state ceding it, as the state will no doubt provide in the compact for the rights and the consent of the citizens inhabiting it, as the inhabitants will find sufficient inducements of interest to become willing parties to the cession, as they will have had their voice in the election of the government, which is to exercise authority over them, as the municipal legislature, for local purposes derived from their own suffrages, will of course be allowed them. This was an interesting one, because that hasn't really panned out exactly in the history of DC. And as the authority of the legislature of the state and of the inhabitants of the ceded part of it concur in the cession will be derived from the whole people of the state in their adoption of the Constitution, every imaginable objection seems to be obviated. Now, if we look around at other countries, most other countries do not have. I guess it would only, you can't really compare it to a unitary government like France. Obviously, the national government of France controls everything. But if you look at a federal government, some federal governments have a federal district and some don't. Like Brazil has one, Mexico has one, Australia has one. But Canada does not. Germany kind of does. I mean, Berlin is its own state, but I don't think it's a federal district under federal government control. I think it is a state in its own right. So I guess some do and some don't. But the reasons he gives here for having a federal district don't really apply anymore. I was thinking about that recently because I saw a video about DC and I was like, because there's this movement for DC to get statehood. But anyway, yeah. So just I thought, wow, here's a part of the Federalist Papers that's actually relevant to a current issue, because this is an actual present issue in American politics. Should the District of Columbia have statehood? Yeah, good thing Belgium hasn't leveraged that enormous power in the EU. Yeah, absolutely. Except I was reading, maybe it was that, was it that video I saw? I was watching a video by Rosenkreuz. He was talking about DC. I think he mentioned France and Strasbourg, or maybe I read that somewhere else. But yeah, sorry. Okay, so um, Luca, I think. Sorry, if Canada, Australia are not federal, why are their governments referred to as federal? They are federal. They are federal. So Australia, yeah. Did I say the reverse? Yeah, Canada, Australia. So Australia, Mexico, and Brazil are federal systems that have federal districts for their capital city. That's what I meant to say. Canada is a federal system, but it does not have a special district for its capital. It put its capital in Ontario. Which, does Ontario get special treatment? Does it get to boss the federal government around? You know, um, it seems to be a non-issue. I mean, obviously Canada has issues, but the fact that Ottawa happens to be located in Ontario doesn't seem to be an issue for how their system works. I'm trying to think of, and then Germany, I guess, is another federal system. But let me think. There, I mean, Russia's federal. Russia's federal. Not really sure how that works. India. Anyway, um, right. Strasbourg is the part where Parliament is, and the rest of the EU are in Brussels, right? Um, okay. Oh, it is an issue. They usually have lower taxes in Ontario compared to other provinces. Is that true? I didn't know that. Oh my gosh. So the federal government levies lower taxes in Ontario, or is it just the combined? Does Ontario just have lower provincial taxes? If I were to select a province that has disproportionate power in Canada, it would not be Ontario. We might be getting into some Canadian politics here. Canada might not be the best example because 80% of their population lives near the capital. Yeah, see, that's the thing. Yeah, I mean, like, it's much more lopsided than the U.S. ever was in terms of population distribution, for sure. I mean, even at Confederation, it was very lopsided. Um, but yeah, okay. So then he moves on to the second part of that clause. The necessity of a like authority over forts, magazines, etc., established by the general government, is not less evident. Public money expended on such places, and the public property deposited in them, require that they should be exempt from the authority of the particular state. Nor would it be proper for the places on which the security of the entire Union may depend to be in any degree dependent on a particular member of it. All objections and scruples are here also obviated by requiring the concurrence of the states concerned in every such establishment. I mean, what I keep seeing over and over again in these, in this, like, this part of the Federalist Papers, but in the Federalist Papers in general, is this very much this gap between the way people at the time thought about the states and the way people today think about the states. I mean, there are some states, depending on the situation, depending on what's going on politically, federally, some state residents can be very jealous of their rights and vis-a-vis the federal government. But in general, I get the impression that it's only in the southern states that people still feel a really strong state identity in a political sense. Correct me if I'm wrong. But I don't get that sense from people in other parts of the country, other parts of the U.S., that they have a strong sense of state identity, like a kind of state level nationalism, which I think was really behind behind the federal capital, federal district issue, but also behind a lot of this other stuff about the construction of the legislative branch and stuff. Number 3, to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted. All right, that's kind of obscure. So let me kind of unpack this. So Congress has the power to declare the punishment of treason. Oh yeah, I think there's some state level pride at least. Yes, there is state level pride. um, or sometimes local, depending on which state. Like, I'm not sure if like Ohio is an like Ohio. I think there's a lot of state pride in Ohio, but in a lot of states, but there are some states like I was just thinking like states with large like big regional differences, like New York, for example. Um, like there's a lot of like there's New York City and then there's upstate and there's not a lot of like common identity, you know. And I was thinking maybe that's true of states where they have like there's multiple centers, like Ohio has Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati. But I think there is a lot of state pride in Ohio, but I don't know. You know, I don't know, like I mean there is, but there like there is and there isn't, you know, like anyway, I guess we're too abstract. Um in a way there's state pride, but there's not like it's not like nationalism, if you know what I mean. Both people in North Dakota are pretty fanatical about it. Yeah. Maryland, yes. I mean, so people in Maryland have a lot of state pride, which is reflected in their flag and in their food, um, and in their accent, stuff like that. But um, but yeah, like if DC were not a district, if it were just part of Maryland, would the other states be jealous? Would people from other states be jealous that Maryland has Washington? Not sure that most of them would care. They barely think about Maryland anyway, you know? Yeah, New England, yeah, there's more of a regional pride in New England. I agree with that. Uh, except they all hate Boston, besides that. Well, I guess everybody in New Hampshire and Vermont hate each other. I guess I should walk back everything I said. Everything I said has an exception to it. Okay. Yeah, a lot of state pride in the U.S. consists of hating somebody from another, hating one other state, you know, like or hating someone in another region, like Northern California and Southern California, um, or like everyone in rural Washington hates Seattle, yeah, that kind of thing. Um, okay, where was I? Oh yeah, as it should be. Um, to declare, so whoops, Congress has the power to declare the punishment of treason. Yeah, Rhode Island is excited when anyone remembers they're there. Yeah, there are a lot of states who feel that way, like Delaware and yeah, to declare the punishment of treason, and then but it also says, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood. So attainder of treason, or attainder was when the Parliament could pass a bill that convicted someone of a crime. So rather than someone being convicted of crime through the judicial process, they would be through they would be legislatively declared a criminal. And then so if the Parliament passed a bill saying that someone was a traitor, then they could also make it so that all of the heirs of that person would have no rights of inheritance. So the property would be taken away from that person, and then and they'd be executed, and then their heirs would not inherit anything from that person. That's what corruption of blood means. And then or forfeiture, forfeiture of property, except during the life of the person attainted. Um, so forfeiture of property would only apply to the person who had been convicted. At Delahoo. Hey, look at Tim. Why don't let U.S. politicians to know about this one? Right, exactly. Well, it's in the Constitution, and they put it in there specifically for. Well, I guess Madison's going to talk about it. I think. So Madison says, as treason may be committed against the United States, the authority of the United States ought to be enabled to punish it. But as newfangled and artificial treasons have been the great engines by which violent factions, the natural offspring of free governments, have usually wreaked their alternate malignity on each other, the convention have. And let me stop actually before I finish that sentence. Make sure we know what this is saying. But when he says newfangled and artificial treasons, by which violent factions, so he's saying like within the legislature, different factions would attack each other in a partisan way by declaring, like exactly what you were thinking. Like if modern politicians had this tool, they would just, whoever controlled Congress would just start declaring people traitors, and punishing them accordingly. And so like that's what he's actually referring to here is violent factions, which are, I think this is an important point to note, the natural offspring of free governments. So this was always something, this was something that the founders were trying to, or the framers, to be more specific, framers of the Constitution were trying to avoid was, it's not a purely democratic system in the sense of like you just have a legislature elected directly by the people, and the legislature does whatever, and so it's just whatever the majority group does is the law. They have checks in place to prevent that, and this, he's touching on this, why that would be the case. Violent factions, the natural offspring of free governments, have usually wreaked their alternate malignity on each other. So different factions coming into position of power, wreaking their malignity on other factions. And because of that, to avoid that, the convention have, with great judgment, opposed a barrier to this peculiar danger by inserting a constitutional definition of the crime, fixing the proof necessary for conviction of it, and restraining the Congress, even in punishing it, from extending the consequences of guilt beyond the person of its author. Treason is the only crime that is actually defined in the Constitution. And Madison here is saying that's on purpose, specifically to prevent this sort of abuse from happening. Luke, Tim, I can imagine it much like the Arthurian knights going around and accusing each other of treachery. Yeah. Okay, number 4, to admit new states. So there's another power that Constitution grants the federal government, to admit new states into the Union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of 2 or more states or parts of states without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. In the Articles of Confederation, no provision is found on this important subject. Canada was to be admitted of right on her joining in the measures of the United States, and the other colonies, by which were evidently meant the other British colonies, at the discretion of 9 states. The eventual establishment, so that's referring to the fact that any colony that want to join the Articles of Confederation, the members would have to agree to that accession, and it would be from the normal policy of 9 out of 13 approving, like any other measure. But Canada had the one exception. I think I've mentioned this a long time ago in this series, where Canada got a special mention in the Articles of Confederation saying if they choose to join, they're automatically accepted. They don't have to get the 9 states' approval. The eventual establishment of new states seems to have been overlooked by the compilers of the Articles of Confederation. We have seen the inconvenience of this omission, and the assumption of power into which Congress had been led by it. With great propriety, therefore, has the new system supplied the defect. The general precaution that no new states shall be formed without the concurrence of the federal authority, and that of the states concerned, is consonant to the principles which ought to govern such transactions. The particular precaution against the erection of new states, by the partition of a state without its consent, quiets the jealousy of the larger states, as that of the smaller is quieted by a like precaution against a junction of states without their consent. So again, it's a way of assuring like having this provision in there assures the big states and the small states that the federal government won't arbitrarily, do things to them, or the other states will, like the federal government or the large states won't arbitrarily combine small states in order to reduce their power in the Senate, or conversely to divide up large states, small states combining in Congress to divide up large states in order to reduce their power in the House, that sort of thing. All right, number 5. To dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States, with a proviso that nothing in the Constitution shall be so construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. This is a power of very great importance, and required by considerations similar to those which show the propriety of the former. Proviso annexed is proper in itself, and was probably rendered absolutely necessary by jealousies and questions concerning the Western Territory sufficiently known to the public. So this is referring mainly to the Northwest Territory, if we look at a map. So the pink are the states, or what would become the states. At this point when he's writing, none of them have ratified the Constitution, but these were the old states under the Articles of Confederation. And then this orange area, which is labeled unorganized territory, was the Northwest Territory. And this was the big issue. And it would later become an issue down in the Southwest when the southern states ceded their western claims. But already in 1788, this Northwest area was of issue. The Articles of Confederation had no good way of handling the Northwest Territory. So they passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1785 to handle that. But then there's a more regular, it became more regularized under the new system. Oh, getting back to the comments, the chat. At this time, Canada referred to what and what was so special about them? Okay. So, it's not on this map. Let me see if we can find a map. So we're in 1788. Columbia. No. Trying to think which one's likely to have a good map of the right time frame. Maybe I'll just look at the Confederation part because it's not too different for our purposes. That'll do fine. Oh, this, I think this is a... Is this going to change on me? Okay, so this was in 1867. Yeah, it doesn't... Yeah, it's not kind of... This is a little bit out of, like, anachronistic, but kind of like... Ontario and Quebec was Canada. Like, these two put together were Canada. And that's what they were referring to. Ontario and Quebec were split off into Canada... I guess they were called Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Actually, maybe there's a map of that. But I think that was around this time or slightly later. Okay, 1791 is when they were split. Oh, man. Okay, yeah. So this is basically the map that we're talking about in this time period. So, except this area down here was ceded to the U.S. after in the Treaty of Paris of 1783. So it'd be modern-day Ontario, not counting all the new stuff, all the, the parts of Ontario where nobody lives. My apologies to the people who live out there. But Ontario and Quebec was Canada. So it would not have included Nova Scotia or Newfoundland. Like, those colonies would have had to get the approval of 9 states. It was just what is now Ontario and Quebec. So at this time, it was still, I believe, one combined colony or dominion, and then it was divided into 2 parts. 1791, apparently. And the upper part, which later became Ontario, or was renamed Ontario, was full of loyalists and other British settlers. So they were culturally different from the French Canadians who lived in Lower Canada, which later was known as Quebec. Yeah, right. No, some very nice wolves in Sudbury, Ontario. Right. Actually, Sudbury has a giant nickel. Um, unfortunately, no one lives within hundreds of miles of it, but there's a really giant, a really big nickel there. Oh well, they don't have a picture of it. That's weird. Thought that was the one thing, the one thing they had. Oh well. Um. Right. Yeah. So that was Canada. So Canada had a free ticket into the Union, but New Brunswick and Nova Scotia had to submit an application with 3 references. That's correct. In fact, New Brunswick was not its own thing. Neither was Prince Edward Island. It was all Nova Scotia, I believe. I won't look it up now. I guess maybe people watching this, well, why not? It was all one. It was all one colony. And then New Brunswick was broken off. Let's see. I should do it this way. Oh, this is 1754. That's a little too early. I feel like it was in the 1790s when they were broken off and made their own thing. I should be looking up New Brunswick, actually. Talk amongst yourselves. Loyalists in the establishment of New Brunswick. Loyalists arrived in 1783. There was an election in 1786. Yeah, I guess it's not jumping out at me, but it was somewhere around that time period when New Brunswick became its own thing. But yeah, they would have had to apply like normal. And I don't know why they were treated differently, why they weren't. I mean, it had recently been French. I don't know. All right, where was I? Yeah, number 6, to guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government, to protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. In a confederacy founded on republican principles and composed of republican members, the superintending government ought clearly to possess authority to defend the system against aristocratic or monarchical innovations. The more intimate the nature of such a union may be, the greater interest have the members in the political institutions of each other, and the greater right to insist that the forms of government under which the compact was entered into should be substantially maintained. But a right implies a remedy, and where else could the remedy be deposited than where it is deposited by the Constitution? Governments of dissimilar principles and forms have been found less adapted to a federal coalition of any sort than those of a kindred nature. As the Confederate Republic of Germany, says Montesquieu, consists of free cities and petty states, subject to different princes, experience shows us that it is more imperfect than that of Holland and Switzerland. Greece was undone, he adds, as soon as the king of Macedon obtained a seat among the Amphictyons. In the latter case, no doubt, the disproportionate force as well as the monarchical form of the new confederate had its share of influence on the events. So, the basic point of all that is, whatever members of a federation or a federal system there should be, they should all be of a similar type. You know, you shouldn't be combining different forms of government together. It won't work, essentially, is what he's arguing there. So that's why they all have to be republics. All the states in the Union have to be republics. It may possibly be asked what need there could be of such a precaution, and whether it may not become a pretext for alterations in the state governments without the concurrence of the states themselves. These questions admit of ready answers. If the interpositions of the general government should not be needed, the provision for such an event will be a harmless superfluity only in the Constitution. But who can say what experiments may be produced by the caprice of particular states, by the ambition of enterprising leaders, or by the intrigues and influence of foreign powers? To the second question, it may be answered that if the general government should interpose by virtue of this constitutional authority, it will be, of course, bound to pursue the authority. But the authority extends no farther than to a guarantee of a republican form of government, which supposes a pre-existing government of the form which is to be guaranteed. In other words, the point he's making, so the objection that he's positing is that what if the government uses this clause as an excuse for just meddling in state government affairs? And he says, look, it's about maintaining it as a republic. All the states are currently republics, so it's not like the federal government would have any bearing. Like it would not be how would it work for the federal government to interfere in a state that's already a republic in the name of making it a republic? That's what Madison's saying here. But the authority extends no farther than to a guarantee of a republican form of government, which supposes a pre-existing government of the form which is to be guaranteed. As long, therefore, as the existing republican forms are continued by the states, they are guaranteed by the federal Constitution. Whenever the states may choose to substitute other republican forms, they have a right to do so and to claim the federal guarantee for the latter. The only restriction imposed on them is that they shall not exchange republican for anti-republican constitutions, a restriction which, it is presumed, will hardly be considered as a grievance. So states are free to change their form of government as long as whatever form of government they use is a republic. A protection against invasion is due from every society to the parts composing it. The latitude of the expression here used seems to secure each state not only against foreign hostility, but against ambitious or vindictive enterprises of its more powerful neighbors. The history both of ancient and modern confederacies proves that the weaker members of the Union ought not to be insensible to the policy of this article. Protection against domestic violence is added with equal propriety. It has been remarked that even among the Swiss cantons, which properly speaking are not under one government, provision is made for this object, and the history of that league informs us that mutual aid is frequently claimed and afforded, and as well by the most democratic as the other cantons. A recent and well-known event among ourselves has warned us to be prepared for emergencies of a like nature. Any guesses what that is he's referring to? A recent and well-known event of domestic violence in one of the states, for which the Articles of Confederation and the system under that had no means of dealing with. All right, let me get caught up in the chat. I've been wondering what happens if Vermont becomes a theocracy, right? Vermont of all states. Right, correct. Shays Rebellion. He's referring to Shays Rebellion. At first, it might seem not to square with the Republican theory to suppose either that a majority have not the right, or that a minority will have the force to subvert a government, and consequently that the federal interposition can never be required but when it would be improper. I think what he's saying there is, like, the anticipated objection that he's expressing here is, in a Republican system, the government would only be changed if it were changed by a majority of the people in that state, and therefore it'd be within the parameters of a republic, and therefore this provision in the Constitution makes no sense because, why then would the federal government be interfering? Like, there would be no occasion when the government would even need to interfere, because the only time a state government would change would be if a majority of the people in that state changed the government. So the only situation where a federal government would be interfering in a state to quote unquote protect a republic would be if it were doing so improperly. because to contravene what the majority of that state had desired. That's the argument he's positing, that he's going to respond to. So Madison says, but theoretic reasoning in this, as in most other cases, must be qualified by the lessons of practice. Why may not illicit combinations for purposes of violence be formed as well by a majority of a state, especially a small state, as by a majority of a county or a district of the same state? And if the authority of the state ought in the latter case to protect the local magistracy, ought not the federal authority in the former to support the state authority? Besides, there are certain parts of the state constitutions which are so interwoven with the federal constitution that a violent blow cannot be given to the one without communicating the wound to the other. Insurrections in a state will rarely induce a federal interposition, unless the number concerned in them bears some proportion to the friends of government. It will be much better that the violence in such cases should be repressed by the superintending power than that the majority should be left to maintain their cause by a bloody and obstinate contest. The existence of a right to interpose will generally prevent the necessity of exerting it. Is it true that force and right are necessarily on the same side in republican governments? May not the minor party possess such a superiority of pecuniary resources, of military talents and experience, or of secret succors from foreign powers, as will render it superior also in an appeal to the sword? May not a more compact and advantageous position turn the scale on the same side against a superior number so situated as to be less capable of a prompt and collected exertion of its strength? Nothing can be more chimerical than to imagine that in a trial of actual force victory may be calculated by the rules which prevail in a census of the inhabitants, or which determine the event of an election. May it not happen, in fine, that the minority of citizens may become a majority of persons by the accession of alien residents, or a casual concourse of adventurers, or of those whom the constitution of the state has not admitted to the rights of suffrage? I take no notice of an unhappy species of population abounding in some of the states, who during the calm of regular government are sunk below the level of men, but who, in the tempestuous scenes of civil violence, may emerge into the human character and give a superiority of strength to any party with which they may associate themselves. So he basically argues you can't say the majority of a state will always be the one changing the government of that state. You can't treat, as he says here, you can't treat an insurrection you can't think about an insurrection the same way you would think about election. Does he say that? Up here. Somewhere up here. Oh, yeah. That victory may be calculated by the rules which prevail in a census of the inhabitants, or which determine the event of an election. And then he goes on to say, well, also there could be and it's got to be for various reasons. The people in the minority might have better military ability. They might have funding from a foreign government or support from a foreign government. Or, as he notes here, there might be a bunch of foreigners who go into that state, help it form, so they become a majority of the population, but not a majority of the citizens. And then he obliquely references something else here. I take no notice of an unhappy species of population abounding in some of the states. I'll leave it to your imagination which species of population he's referring to there. Lurino, it's funny to think about how much the framers were worried about states rising up against the federal government or act against republicanism from the perspective. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of the stuff he's saying here would not apply. Like the idea, he said something up here, somewhere where he said, where an insurrection might be happening in a state. Oh, I can't remember now exactly how he said it. But yeah, there's so much stuff he says about states and what states would be doing that nowadays, it would be inconceivable. Like the idea, just as a random example, it just occurred to me, the idea of a border state having to provide for its own defense if it got invaded before the federal government is able to do anything about it. Like nowadays, like isn't even conceivable. Like the federal government has this enormous military that is monitoring all of our borders and well beyond it. If if a U.S. state were attacked now, it would be the federal government that's defending it immediately. Like there's no situation where the state government would have to organize its own defense temporarily while it's waiting for the federal government to be able to respond. Stuff like that is just not even conceived of in the Federalist Papers. Yeah, well, yeah, this is 13 years before the revolution in Haiti, but Madison's already foreseeing slave rebellions. Absolutely, Americans in the U.S. were already absolutely thinking about slave rebellions. It's something they thought about during the American Revolution when the British were stirring up trouble in the southern states, in the southern colonies during the Revolutionary War. Um, this was an ever-present consideration on the part of Americans, in part of white American, well, and black Americans too, but on the part of Americans, especially living in southern states that had a lot of slaves, they were constantly paranoid about rebellion, about slave rebellion. Um, like in laws saying it's illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. I mean, I assume that relates to that. Like it's so that you don't have slaves reading political philosophy and then getting into their heads to launch rebellions. I think I guess that's not my field, but I assume that's why laws like that existed. Um uh yeah, it was very much on people's minds. Oh yeah, Spartacus. I I hope they weren't naming their slave Spartacus because that would be so ironic. I'm sure they were not doing that. Um but yeah. I mean, they did use a lot of classicizing names, which I don't know. I feel a little bit weird about. I don't know exactly why they would name their slaves things like Caesar and Pompey and stuff like that. I assume it was a kind of condescension. That's the way I read it. I don't know if I'm reading it correctly. But it was kind of being in an ironic sense to name a slave a name like that. But yeah, Spartacus, that'd be wild if a slave owner named a slave Spartacus. Um, yeah, exactly. Same reason Romans named their dogs Rex. Yep, that's right. It's all part of the dehumanization. Okay, so Madison continues. In cases where it may be doubtful on which side justice lies, what better umpires could be desired by two violent factions, flying to arms and tearing a state to pieces, than the representatives of Confederate states not heated by the local flame? To the impartiality of judges, they would unite the affection of friends. Happy would it be if such a remedy for infirmities could be enjoyed by all free governments, if a project equally effectual could be established for the universal peace of mankind. Should it be asked, what is to be the redress for an insurrection pervading all the states and comprising a superiority of the entire force, though not a constitutional right? The answer must be that such a case, as it would be without the compass of human remedies, so it is fortunately not within the compass of human probability, and that it is a sufficient recommendation of the federal constitution that it diminishes the risk of a calamity, for which no possible constitution can provide a cure. Yeah, Blue Harino, everyone wanted to roleplay as Romans. Yeah, that's right. That's been like Western civilization for 1,500 years. It's been basically Roman LARPing. I mean, obviously it's an oversimplification, but there's definitely an element of that. All the way down through the centuries. All right. Among the advantages of a Confederate republic enumerated by Montesquieu, an important one is that should a popular insurrection happen in one of the states, the others are able to quell it. Should abuses creep into one part, they are reformed by those that remain sound. Number 7, to consider all debts contracted and engagements entered into before the adoption of this Constitution as being no less valid against the United States under this Constitution than under the Confederation. This can only be considered as a declaratory proposition, and may have been inserted among other reasons for the satisfaction of the foreign creditors of the United States, who cannot be strangers to the pretended doctrine that a change in the political form of civil society has the magical effect of dissolving its moral obligations. Among the lesser criticisms which have been exercised on the Constitution, it has been remarked that the validity of engagements ought to have been inserted in favor of the United States as well as against them, and in the spirit which usually characterizes little critics, the omission has been transformed and magnified into a plot against the national rights. The authors of this discovery may be told, what few others need be informed of, that as engagements are in their nature reciprocal, an assertion of their validity on one side necessarily involves a validity on the other side, and that as the article is merely declaratory, the establishment of the principle in one case is sufficient for every case. They may be further told that every constitution must limit its precautions to dangers that are not altogether imaginary, and that no real danger can exist that the government would dare, with or even without this constitutional declaration before it, to remit the debts justly due to the public on the pretext here condemned. Number 8, provide for amendments to be ratified by 3/4 of the states under 2 exceptions only. That useful alterations will be suggested by experience could not but be foreseen. It was requisite, therefore, that a mode for introducing them should be provided. The mode preferred by the convention seems to be stamped with every mark of propriety. It guards equally against that extreme facility which would render the Constitution too mutable, and that extreme difficulty which might perpetuate its discovered faults. It moreover equally enables the general and the state governments to originate the amendment of errors as they may be pointed out by the experience on one side or on the other. And so at this point here about amending the Constitution is like that's one that I've heard before as one of the strengths of our Constitution, something that Americans are very proud of, is the particular way in which amendments work. It's just the right. It's a Goldilocks amount of difficulty in amending the Constitution. That's the claim that people make. That's the claim Madison's making here. It's not so easy to amend that any dumb idea can get incorporated into the Constitution. But on the other hand, it's not so difficult that when an error or a problem in the Constitution is spotted, like, it's not so difficult that it can't be fixed. Like, it is easy enough to accomplish. It's 3/4 of the states, and also it's not quoted here, but also 2/3, I believe, of both houses of Congress. The exception in favor of the equality of suffrage in the Senate. So I actually talked about this in a previous stream. The 2 exceptions to the Constitution. Not this part. Here's the Constitution. Where does it talk about amendments? Article 5, right? Yeah. 2/3 of both houses, right? 2/3 of both houses, and 3/4 of the states. Oh, it's 2/3 of the houses of Congress, or 2/3 of the states. You can call a convention, and then it's approved by 3/4 of the states. Okay. But there are 2 exceptions to the normal amending process of the Constitution. One is that the slave trade cannot be, the importation of slaves from abroad cannot be prohibited before the year 1808, and that the Senate cannot be changed in its composition. And so here Madison says the exception in favor of the equality of suffrage in the Senate, in other words, that every state gets equal representation in the Senate, 2 senators each state, that exception, that cannot be amended away, that can't be changed by constitutional amendment, was probably meant as a palladium to the residuary sovereignty of the states, implied and secured by that principle of representation in one branch of the legislature. and was probably insisted on by the states particularly attached to that equality, in other words, the small states. The other exception must have been admitted on the same consideration which produced the privilege defended by it. I actually don't understand this sentence, but I assume that he's getting at the fact that it was slave states. So just, the provision about the Senate, representation of the Senate cannot be changed, and that was, he says, probably a palladium to the small states. And then not banning the importation of slaves before 1808 was probably a palladium to the slave states. I think that's what he's getting at. All right. Aficonogras. The original Virginia plan required no cooperation from Congress in amending the Constitution. Oh, interesting. I didn't. It was just the states, huh? Well, technically, I guess if I'm reading this correctly, you don't. According to the words here, you don't necessarily need the cooperation of Congress. Because it says Congress, 2/3 of each house. Either Congress proposes an amendment by 2/3 of each house, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So the states, 2/3 of the states could get together and propose an amendment, and Congress doesn't have to be involved. Okay, I hope Primaris understands that despite our completely tangential jokes in the chat that spiral into irrelevance, we're still intently listening. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Aviconograz, the idea being that if somehow the legislative branch got overpowerful relative to the other branches, we wouldn't need Congress to vote. Yes, exactly. So, number 9. Ratification of the Convention of 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between the states ratifying the same. This was a thing that upset some people, that the Articles of Confederation technically went into effect when all of the states approved it. So it didn't actually go into effect until 1783 or 1781 or 83 or something like that, early 1780s. I think Maryland was the holdout. But then the new Constitution goes into effect with 9 states approving. Some people were like, that's not cool. It should be like the Articles of it should be unanimous or something. So this is Madison's response to that. This article speaks for itself. The express authority of the people alone could give due validity to the Constitution. To have required the unanimous ratification of the 13 states would have subjected the essential interests of the whole to the caprice or corruption of a single member. He's speaking from experience, remembering Maryland, I think it was Maryland, back in the early 80s. It would have marked a want of foresight in the convention which our own experience would have rendered inexcusable, like the experience of what had happened with the Articles of Confederation. 2 questions of a very delicate nature present themselves on this occasion. 1. On what principle the Confederation, which stands in the solemn form of a compact among the states, can be superseded without the unanimous consent of the parties to it? 2. What relation is to subsist between the 9 or more states ratifying the Constitution and the remaining few who do not become parties to it? This second one, it's actually one someone asked me about a long time ago in an earlier stream. If it took 9 states for the Constitution to go into effect, what happens to the states that, what if a state had never ratified the Constitution? Would they have been forced into it, or what? What would have happened? So here he's going to address that. I already addressed it, but he's going to address it. The first question is answered at once by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case. In other words, on what principle the Confederation can be superseded without the unanimous consent of the parties to it. Why is that okay? And he says that can be answered by recurring to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation. So he's falling back on pragmatism. He's saying, yeah, by the letter of the law, we're not, he doesn't come out and say this, but essentially he says, yeah, we're not doing it exactly correct according to the letter of things, by undoing the Articles of Confederation with just 9 states. However, we have to do it this way. It's pragmatic. It's an issue of practical necessity. That's the argument he's making here. We recur to the absolute necessity of the case, to the great principle of self-preservation, to the transcendent law of nature and of nature's God, which declares that the safety and happiness of society are the objects at which all political institutions aim, and to which all such institutions must be sacrificed. So he's doing a kind of end run where he's like, the critics are appealing to the Articles of Confederation and saying, well, the Articles of Confederation have to be, like, this kind of thing has to be handled unanimously. He's appealing to what's behind the Articles of Confederation. Essentially what he's saying, well, the Articles of Confederation are there to ensure our safety and happiness. So he's appealing to the safety and happiness. Well, in order for us to achieve safety and happiness, we have to ignore this provision in the Articles of Confederation, which was impractical and was actually getting in the way of our safety and happiness. That's how he's arguing this. Perhaps, Madison says, also an answer may be found without searching beyond the principles of the compact itself. It has been heretofore noted among the defects of the Confederation that in many of the states it had received no higher sanction than a mere legislative ratification. The principle of reciprocality seems to require that its obligation on the other states should be reduced to the same standard. A compact between independent sovereigns founded on acts of legislative authority can pretend to no higher validity than a league or treaty between the parties. It is an established doctrine on the subject of treaties that all the articles are mutually conditions of each other, that a breach of any one article is a breach of the whole treaty, and that a breach committed by either of the parties absolves the others, and authorizes them, if they please, to pronounce the compact violated and void. Should it unhappily be necessary to appeal to these delicate truths for a justification for dispensing with the consent of particular states to a dissolution of the federal pact, will not the complaining parties find it a difficult task to answer the multiplied and important infractions with which they may be confronted? The time has been when it was incumbent on us all to veil the ideas which this paragraph exhibits. The scene is now changed, and with it the part which the same motives dictate. So this second part of the paragraph, he makes a second separate argument, which is that the Articles of Confederation were essentially a treaty among separate countries, an international treaty. And according to international law, if the parties to a treaty violate any of the provisions of that treaty, the treaty is null and void. That's what he's arguing here. I don't actually know if that's true, but that's what he's arguing. And he says, well, many of the states have violated various provisions in the Articles of Confederation multiple times. So, Articles of Confederation are null and void. That's his other argument. The second question, which is about a state not joining, not ratifying the Constitution, what happens to that state? The second question is not less delicate, and the flattering prospect of its being merely hypothetical forbids us over-curious discussion of it. It is one of those cases which must be left to provide for itself. In other words, let's just wait and see, is what he's saying. In general, so in other words, he had no idea how to answer that question. And he's saying, since it's hypothetical, let's just wait till it actually happens and then figure it out. But then he says, in general, it may be observed that although no political relation can subsist between the assenting and dissenting states, yet the moral relations will remain uncancelled. The claims of justice, both on one side and on the other, will be in force and must be fulfilled. The rights of humanity must in all cases be duly and mutually respected, whilst considerations of a common interest, and above all the remembrance of the endearing scenes which are past, and the anticipation of a speedy triumph over the obstacles to reunion, will, it is hoped, not urge in vain moderation on one side and prudence on the other. Publius. So what he's saying in that paragraph is, technically that state would not be a part of the Union and would not enjoy the rights and privileges like pertaining to being a member of the Union. So it would, according to law, be a separate country. It would be a foreign country. However, we can still have moral unity. We can still recognize, and he makes these kind of sentimental appeals, considerations of a common interest, and above all the remembrance of the endearing scenes which are past. In other words, we had this shared experience of going through the revolution together, and that should give us a sense of moral unity, if not legal and constitutional unity. And then he ends with, it is hoped speedy triumph over the obstacles of reunion will, it is hoped, not urge in vain moderation on one side and prudence on the other. So moderation on the one side, he's referring to the Union, not, treating the Union treating that non-member state in a moderate fashion. This is how I interpret it. This is my reading of Madison, and that state would be prudent, would on its side act prudently. In other words, do the prudent thing and join the Union later on. That was Madison's take on that question. Iconograts, Madison gets to be a world-class expert at circumlocution when talking about slavery. Absolutely. That passage on slavery, I was like, when I read that, I was like, what the heck? And that's in the Constitution too, by the way. They managed to refer to slavery without ever, like, if you look at Article 5, nowhere in the Constitution is the word slavery used. Provided that no amendment, this is it. Provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clauses in the 9th section of the first article. Oh, wait, so we have to go back to Article 1, Section 9. Right here. This is where it talks about importation of slaves. The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. And then, did he say fourth? First and fourth clauses. I would not have realized the fourth clause was referring to it. No capitation or other direct tax may be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. Oh, yeah, and that's referring to the census provision, the part where it talks about the census, which, again, where it talks about census, it has the 3/5 compromise. But again, there, it does not ever it doesn't ever use the word slave. It's weird how they were always like finding ways to talk around it. And I see this in the Federalist Papers too. I was reading somewhere long time, months ago, like after I'd started this stream, but like this series, but like a long time ago, I read somewhere that slavery is only referred to once in the whole of the Federalist Papers. I thought, oh, that's interesting. But I've been reading the Federalist Papers. Actually, slavery is mentioned multiple times. It's just, they do it in this really circumlocucious way. Blockade Rhode Island until they capitulate probably wouldn't have been a good thing to suggest out loud before anyone ratified. Yeah, that's probably what they would have ended up doing. That's probably what this moderation is referring to, is not just outright invading India style. You know how India invaded some of its, like they invaded Goa and stuff in order to bring them into the Union, Mysore and stuff like that. Okay. So we're going to move on to 44. So it's same view, continued and concluded. So same topic, it's just a continuation of it. A fifth class of provisions in favor of the federal authority consists of the following restrictions on the authority of the several states. 1. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver a legal tender in payment of debt, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. The prohibition against treaties, alliances, and confederations makes a part of the existing Articles of Union, and for reasons which need no explanation is copied into the new Constitution. Prohibition of letters of marque is another part of the old system, but is somewhat extended in the new. According to the former, letters of marque could be granted by the states after a declaration of war. According to the latter, these licenses must be obtained as well during the war as previous to its declaration from the government of the United States. This alteration is fully justified by the advantage of uniformity in all points which relate to foreign powers, and of immediate responsibility to the nation in all those for whose conduct the nation itself is to be responsible. The right of coining money, which is here taken from the states, was left in their hands by the Confederation as a concurrent right with that of Congress, under an exception in favor of the exclusive right of Congress to regulate the alloy and value. In this instance also, the new provision is an improvement on the old. Whilst the alloy and value depended on the general authority, a right of coinage in the particular states could have no other effects than to multiply expensive mints and diversify the forms and weights of the circulating pieces. The latter inconveniency defeats one purpose for which the power was originally submitted to the federal head, and as far as the former might prevent an inconvenient remittance of gold and silver to the central mint for recoinage, the end can be as well attained by local mints established under the general authority. The extension of the prohibition to bills of credit must give pleasure to every citizen in proportion to his love of justice and his knowledge of the true springs of public prosperity. The loss which America has sustained since the peace, from the pestilent effects of paper money on the necessary confidence between man and man, on the necessary confidence in the public councils, on the industry and morals of the people, and on the character of republican government, constitutes an enormous debt against the states, chargeable with this unadvised measure, which must long remain unsatisfied, or rather an accumulation of guilt which can be expiated no otherwise than by a voluntary sacrifice on the altar of justice of the power which has been the instrument of it. In addition to these persuasive considerations, it may be observed that the same reasons which show the necessity of denying to the states the power of regulating coin prove with equal force that they ought not to be at liberty to substitute a paper medium in the place of coin. Had every state a right to regulate the value of its coin, there might be as many different currencies as states, and thus the intercourse among them would be impeded. Retrospective alterations in its value might be made, and thus the citizens of other states be injured, and animosities be kindled among the states themselves. Subjects of foreign powers might suffer from the same cause, and hence the union be discredited and embroiled by the indiscretion of a single member. No one of these mischiefs is less incident to a power in the states to emit paper money than to coin gold or silver. The power to make anything but gold and silver a tender in the payment of debts is withdrawn from the states on the same principle with that of striking a paper currency. Bills of attainder, ex post facto laws, and laws impairing the obligation of contracts are contrary to the first principles of the social compact and to every principle of sound legislation. The two former are expressly prohibited by the declarations prefixed to some of the state constitutions, and all of them are prohibited by the spirit and scope of these fundamental charters. Our own experience has taught us, nevertheless, that additional fences against these dangers ought not to be omitted. Very properly, therefore, have the Convention added this constitutional bulwark in favor of personal security and private rights, and I am much deceived if they have not, in so doing, as faithfully consulted the genuine sentiments as the undoubted interests of their constituents. The sober people of America are weary of the fluctuating policy which has directed the public councils. They have seen with regret and with indignation that sudden changes and legislative interferences in cases affecting personal rights become jobs in the hands of enterprising and influential speculators, and snares to the more industrious and less informed parts of the community. They have seen, too, that one legislative interference is but the link of a long chain of repetitions, every subsequent interference being naturally produced by the effects of the preceding. They very rightly infer, therefore, that some thorough reform is wanting, which will banish speculations on public measures, inspire a general prudence in industry, and give a regular course to the business of society. Prohibition with respect to titles of nobility is copied from the Articles of Confederation and needs no comment. I mean, this thing about money is the kind of thing where, like, it would never occur to Americans today that states would issue their own money, their own currency. We just take it for granted that's something the federal government does, and we're all happy. We're all fine with it. But it was, it was something that was taking away power from the states at the time. Okay, Blue Harino, are you more of a Madison or Hamilton fan when it comes to the writing? Oh, good question. I like both of them. I'll have to think about that. I might lean more toward Hamilton, but some of the most famous passages and famous essays in the Federalist Papers are the ones from Madison. You know, so, and he's a good writer. Oh yeah, I'll have to think about that one. Blue Jay, hey, hello Blue Jay, thanks for coming by. I am having a good day. Mateo, thanks for, yeah, thank you. Good evening to you. Um, okay, so number 2. No state shall, without the consent of the Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the neat produce of all duties and imposts laid by any state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty on tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state, or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay. Oh yeah, that was the part I was referring to before. States can't engage in war unless they're invaded and have to respond. Yeah. So Madison says the restraint on the power of the states over imports and exports is enforced by all the arguments which prove the necessity of submitting the regulation of trade to the federal councils. It is needless, therefore, to remark further on this head than that the manner in which the restraint is qualified seems well calculated at once to secure to the states a reasonable discretion in providing for the conveniency of their imports and exports, and to the United States a reasonable check against the abuse of this discretion. The remaining particulars of this clause fall within reasonings which are either so obvious or have been so fully developed that they may be passed over without remark. The 6th and last class consists of the several powers and provisions by which efficacy is given to all the rest. 1. Of these, the first is the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. Few parts of the Constitution have been assailed with more intemperance than this. The reason for that, so looking back at this clause, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Critics of the Constitution saw that and said that basically gives the Congress, under the new system, a blank check to make whatever law they want. And so that was the reason for the fear about this clause, the objection to it. So Madison's response is, on a fair investigation of it, as has been elsewhere shown, no part can appear more completely invulnerable. Without the substance of this power, the whole Constitution would be a dead letter. Those who object to the article, therefore, can only mean that the form of the provision is improper. But had they considered whether a better form could have been substituted? I'm not sure if that was what the criticism always was about the form of the provision. I think a lot of people were talking about the substance, but I think what Madison is subtly saying there is no one could reasonably object to the substance of the provision because then, as he says, then the Constitution would be of no effect. You can't possibly have the Constitution even work if you don't say that Congress has the power to make laws to carry out the Constitution. So, or to carry out the powers that are granted to Congress by the Constitution. So I feel my reading is he's doing a little bit of a rhetorical trick here by saying they must just be objecting to the wording. So Madison continues, there are 4 other possible methods by which the convention might have taken on this subject. I like what Madison's doing here because he's calling the he's being very gentlemanly about how he's like his position evidently, and maybe I'm reading into it more than this there, but my reading of this is Madison thinks that objection is dumb. And he's like, why, like if you just think about it for 5 seconds, you know that this provision has to be in there. That's how I'm reading Madison. And so he's going to spend, he's kind of unpacking it and carrying all of the alternative options to an absurd conclusion in order to demonstrate that you really have no choice but to do it this way. Aficonograd's Colorado is going to have to dismantle their fleet of nuclear submarines. Yep. The anti-federalists missed the boat there if they expected the clause to be in danger of being read as carte blanche instead of the interstate commerce clause. Now, this would become an issue, though, and maybe I'm coming in too early to talk about this. He has a long discussion of his. But so this is Madison writing this. Let me see if I can remember where this is. Is this power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers? I keep going to the Articles of Confederation. Okay, so I think this is Section 8. Yeah, this is the part he's quoting, very end of Section 8. Make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. This would actually become an issue in the 1790s when Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, proposed the Bank of the United States, which Madison objected to on constitutional grounds. So they actually disagreed over this issue because it says Hamilton was appealing to the very beginning of Section 8. Congress shall have so what the issue was. Hamilton said Congress should set up a federal bank. There should be a bank that's chartered on a federal level. And Jefferson and Madison said that's unconstitutional because the Constitution doesn't say anything about giving Congress the power to create a bank. And Hamilton appealed to this part. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. And it can make laws which be necessary and proper for carrying on the execution of the foregoing powers. And so Hamilton's like, well, this is going to help with the general welfare of the United States, and therefore it's within Congress's power to do it. But Madison did not read the Constitution that way, and he believed that it was actually unconstitutional. So it's interesting to see him arguing this side of it right at this point. So let's see what he said. Where was I? Yeah, so Madison continues. There are 4 other possible methods which the convention might have taken on this subject. They might have copied the second article of the existing confederation, which would have prohibited the exercise of any power not expressly delegated. So that's the term. That's the wording the Articles of Confederation said, which is that. Well, I'll show you. Since I keep bringing this up anyway, I might as well actually use it. This is the Articles of Confederation. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this confederation expressly delegated, expressly is the operative word here, expressly delegated to the United States and Congress assembled. So what the new Constitution is doing is it doesn't have that provision. It doesn't say expressly delegated. So it doesn't have to come out and say expressly every single power that it has that is not delegated to the states. So Madison says, well, instead of having this clause about Congress shall make any law necessary for accomplishing its powers, instead of doing that, they could have just taken that provision from the Articles of Confederation and said, and prohibited the exercise of any power not expressly delegated. Secondly, they might have attempted a positive enumeration of the powers comprehended under the general terms necessary and proper. Third, they might have attempted a negative enumeration of powers by specifying the powers accepted from the general definition. And fourth, they might have been altogether silent on the subject, leaving these necessary and proper powers to construction and inference. Had the convention taken the first method of adopting the second article of the Confederation, it is evident that the new Congress would be continually exposed, as their predecessors have been, to the alternative of construing the term expressly with so much rigor as to disarm the government of all real authority whatever, or with so much latitude as to destroy altogether the force of the restriction. It would be easy to show, if it were necessary, that no important power delegated by the Articles of Confederation has been or can be executed by Congress without recurring more or less to the doctrine of construction or implication. As the powers delegated under the new system are more extensive, the government which is to administer it would find itself still more distressed with the alternative of betraying the public interest by doing nothing, or of violating the Constitution by exercising powers indispensably necessary and proper, but at the same time not expressly granted. And then he addresses the second point, the second possible alternative option. Had the convention attempted a positive enumeration of the powers necessary and proper for carrying the other powers into effect, in other words, just listing every single power that Congress will have and leaving it all unambiguous, just like explicitly listing all of them. If it had done that, the attempt would have involved a complete digest of laws on every subject to which the Constitution relates, accommodated not only to the existing state of things, but to all the possible changes which futurity might produce. For in every new application of a general power, the particular powers, which are the means of attaining the object of the general power, must always necessarily vary with that object, and be often properly varied whilst the object remains the same. And then the third alternative, had they attempted to enumerate the particular powers or means not necessary or proper for carrying the general powers into execution. In other words, the opposite, saying like the federal government Congress has all power except these particular ones. The task would have been no less chimerical, and would have been liable to this further objection that every defect in the enumeration would have been equivalent to a positive grant of authority. If, to avoid this consequence, they had attempted a partial enumeration of the exceptions and described the residue by the general terms not necessary or proper, it must have happened that the enumeration would comprehend a few of the accepted powers only. These would be such as would be least likely to be assumed or tolerated, because the enumeration would of course select such as would be least necessary or proper, and that the unnecessary and improper powers included in the residuum would be less forcibly accepted than if no partial enumeration had been made. And then he addresses the fourth alternative. Had the Constitution been silent on this head, there can be no doubt that all the particular powers requisite as means of executing the general powers would have resulted to the government by unavoidable implication. No axiom is more clearly established in law or in reason than that wherever the end is required, the means are authorized. Wherever a general power to do a thing is given, every particular power necessary for doing it is included. Had this last method therefore been pursued by the convention, every objection now urged against their plan would remain in all its plausibility, and the real inconveniency would be incurred of not removing a pretext which may be seized on critical occasions for drawing into question the essential powers of the Union. If it be asked what is to be the consequence in case the Congress shall misconstrue this part of the Constitution and exercise powers not warranted by its true meaning, I answer the same as if they should misconstrue or enlarge any other power vested in them, as if the general power had been reduced to particulars, and any one of these were to be violated, the same, in short, as if the state legislatures should violate their respective constitutional authorities. In the first instance, the success of the usurpation will depend on the executive and judiciary departments, which are to expound and give effect to the legislative acts. And in the last resort, a remedy must be obtained from the people, who can, by the election of more faithful representatives, annul the acts of the usurpers. The truth is that this ultimate redress may be more confided in against unconstitutional acts of the federal than of the state legislatures, for this plain reason, that as every such act of the former will be an invasion of the rights of the latter, these will be ever ready to mark the innovation, sound the alarm to the people, and to exert their local influence in effecting a change of federal representatives. There being no such intermediate body between the state legislatures and the people, interested in watching the conduct of the former, violations of the state constitution are more likely to remain unnoticed and unredressed. So over on these 2 pages, he basically makes the argument that the clause as it is in the Constitution is the best possible clause. Every other possible way that it could have been handled would be worse. So that's the argument he makes on these 2 pages. And then on this page, he makes another kind of appeal to the federal system as like the federal system is innately more stable and less corrupt, like which is an argument he's made multiple times previously, where he says on the federal level, if Congress or government in general is going to act unconstitutionally and take rights away from people or states, the states will be watching what the federal government does and will be able to catch it and will be able to respond to it and organize resistance to it or a response to it. Whereas if that kind of thing happens on the state level, there is no recourse, there is no watchdog. There's nothing in between the state legislature and the people. Afghanigrads, the wording of the second article of Confederation seems similar to the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. Yeah, it is kind of like that. Let's look at that. So, Article 2. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, or right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated. Actually, I don't know if the amendments are on this page. Yeah. Power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution or prohibited to it by the states or reserved to the states respectively or to the people. It is kind of like that. Yeah. There is a difference, though. So this one does not assume that the states have any sovereignty. All it says is that any powers that aren't granted to the federal government revert to the states. But this one says states are independent countries, and therefore, it's kind of, yeah. So there is a subtle difference. All right. Number 2, this Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. The indiscreet zeal of the adversaries to the Constitution has betrayed them into an attack on this part of it also, without which it would have been evidently and radically defective. To be fully sensible of this, we need only suppose for a moment that the supremacy of the state constitutions had been left complete by a saving clause in their favor. In the first place, as these constitutions invest the state legislatures with absolute sovereignty, in all cases not excepted by the existing Articles of Confederation, all the authorities contained in the proposed Constitution, so far as they exceed those enumerated in the Confederation, would have been annulled, and the new Congress would have been reduced to the same impotent condition with their predecessors. In the next place, as the constitutions of some of the states do not even expressly and fully recognize the existing powers of the Confederacy, an express saving of the supremacy of the former would in such states have brought into question every power contained in the proposed Constitution. In the third place, as the constitutions of the states differ much from each other, it might happen that a treaty or national law of great and equal importance to the states would interfere with some and not with other constitutions, and would consequently be valid in some of the states at the same time that it would have no effect in others. In fine, the world would have seen for the first time a system of government founded on an inversion of the fundamental principles of all government. It would have seen the authority of the whole society everywhere subordinate to the authority of the parts. It would have seen a monster in which the head was under the direction of the members. Number 3, the senators and representatives and the members of the several state legislatures and all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and the several states, shall be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. It has been asked why it was thought necessary that the state magistracy should be bound to support the federal Constitution and unnecessary that a like oath should be imposed on the officers of the United States in favor of the state constitutions. Several reasons might be assigned for the distinctions. I content myself with one, which is obvious and conclusive. The members of the federal government will have no agency in carrying the state constitutions into effect. The members and officers of the state governments, on the contrary, will have an essential agency in giving effect to the federal constitution. The election of the President and Senate will depend in all cases on the legislatures of the several states. And the election of the House of Representatives will equally depend on the same authority in the first instance, and will probably forever be conducted by the officers and according to the laws of the states. 4. Among the provisions for giving efficacy to the federal powers might be added those which belong to the executive and judiciary departments. But as these are reserved for particular examination in another place, I pass them over in this. We have now reviewed in detail all the articles composing the sum or quantity of power delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government, and are brought to this undeniable conclusion that no part of the power is unnecessary or improper for accomplishing the necessary objects of the Union. The question, therefore, whether this amount of power shall be granted or not, resolves itself into another question, whether or not a government commensurate to the exigencies of the Union shall be established, or in other words, whether the Union itself shall be preserved. Publius. All right, so any questions or comments? So after this, we're moving into another part of his argument, where he's going to talk about the relationship of the federal government and the states. As the little title for number 45 says, a further discussion of the supposed danger from the powers of the Union to the state governments. So that'll be the topic of the next stream. We'll be covering those two essays. All right, so that'll do it for me. If no one has any thoughts. Blue Harino sounds like he's being swayed to the pro-Federalist side. I mean, I gotta admit, I do find it pretty persuasive too. Yeah, there are people who go into, there are a couple of my videos on YouTube that get comments relating to the Articles of Confederation. One in particular, I guess, the 1789 presidential election. And I regularly get like every once in a while, not all the time, not every day, but every once in a while, someone will go in there with a comment of, boy, the Articles of Confederation were great. I wish we could go back to that. They should read the Federalist Papers. Maybe they would be persuaded otherwise. Aficonograd says, Madison's idea that states would act as watchdogs against federal overreach nullification. No, well, I mean, that's a good question. Maybe when he was, because he was in favor of that, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, wasn't he? Didn't he write one of them? Oh gosh, I'm showing my ignorance about American history. I think he was responsible, actually, for them. Yeah. Yeah, he wrote the Virginia one. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder if he believed that that's what they were doing. I wonder if he saw it in those terms. Gosh, I know I'm not a historian. I'm depending on you guys to tell me what's going on. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly not how I read it, but yeah, I guess so. I guess that's kind of what he's getting at. Well, I mean, how does he phrase it? Like, what exactly did he say the states would do? Where was it? Did I go too far? I can't remember where we were when we were talking about that. Oh, it's right here, isn't it? It's on this page. The truth is that this ultimate redress may be more confided in against unconstitutional acts of the federal than of the state. Oh, no, that's not it. And the executive and judiciary departments, which are to expound. Yeah, isn't it? This is where he talks about it, isn't it? Invasion of the rights of the latter will be ever ready to mark the innovation to sound the alarm. This is what he said the states would do, to sound the alarm to the people and to exert their local influence in effecting a change of federal representatives. Okay. Yeah, so he's not actually talking about, he's talking about in the next election. I guess he's operating, he's imagining a world where there's no press, maybe? Because all he says is the states would inform the people that this is happening in D.C. so that they would know to vote for other federal representatives. Yeah, and that's borne out by how he phrases the issue with the state legislatures, because he says there's no intermediary between, right, he says right here, there being no such intermediate body between the state legislatures and the people interested in watching the conduct of the former, violations of the state constitution are more likely to remain unnoticed and unredressed. So, yeah, he's not talking about nullification. He's talking about simply informing the voting public so that at the next election, they will know to vote for other representatives that will undo what they did. We're to assume the non-existence of the press in a guest. Yeah, right. He's publishing this in a newspaper. And then he's like, people would have no idea what's going on in D.C. Yeah, that is weird. It's a weird argument. I gotta say, it's a weird argument. Not gonna lie, as the kids say. Yeah. I don't know why, unless he's trying to like account for all possibilities. Like he knows. I guess maybe he's thinking, let's just try to steel man his argument. He might be thinking about like indefinitely into the future. Like as long as the Constitution is in effect, there will be states, there will be a federal government, right? But we can't assume there will always be a press. Perhaps we should look at it that way. Like you can't count on a press fulfilling a constitutional function in the system, because press isn't part of the constitutional system. It's part of the public. It's something outside of it. So you can't set up this constitutional system and say, oh, it'll work because we'll have journalists. We'll have this outside force that'll make sure it works. So maybe it's from that point of view. He's thinking about just like the system working internally, I guess. Yeah, my principal source of national news is my local government. That's once again, this is strikingly different from what the U.S. is like now. The idea that I would go to my local government to find out, or go to my state legislature to find out what D.C.'s doing. Yeah, not gonna lie, kind of sus. Yep, absolutely. He's envisioning the downfall of mainstream media due to 4chan. Madison was a visionary individual. He could see 4chan. He knew that would be in America's future. All right. So yeah, that's all I have. So why isn't he on my money? Madison? Now that's a good question. Hamilton's on your money. Madison. I wonder if Madison, there are denominations higher than $100. It's just that they don't circulate in the public, in the general public, Although at some point in the future with inflation, we may have to start introducing 500. Well, wait, hold on. Nobody uses currency anymore. What am I saying? But anyway, there are bills that are higher than 100. There's 500, 1,000, 5,000, etc. But they're only used by banks. Or I don't. Maybe they're not even used by banks anymore. They were used by banks in the old days when banks would actually use cash in their vault. Um, so I wonder if Madison's on one of those. Yeah, Jackson's on the 20. Yeah, that's controversial. The man who despised the second bank of the United States, made it one of his chief policy goals to destroy it. Federal Reserve, he would have hated the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve, what do? They put him on the $20 bill. Weird. Yes, Samuel P. Chase is on one of those. Well, let's see if we can find out. There's got to be. I'm using Wikipedia because the rest of the internet is such a cesspool nowadays. 10, 15 years ago, I would have just looked for it in a search engine and found an actual site that would tell me. So here's the 500. That's McKinley. McKinley's on the 500. Federal Reserve, no. Maybe it's over here. Where would it be? Huh. There's gotta be somewhere. Oh, here we are. Okay, wait. Oh, this is from 1918. Let's go forward in time. Oh dear. Okay. I guess these are the current ones. So McKinley's on the 500, Cleveland's on the 1,000, Madison is on the $5,000 bill, and Samuel P. Chase is on the 10,000. Oh, I wanted to see a big picture of it. There's Madison. He got some money. Okay, of all the people to put on the $50,000. Wait, there's a $50,000 bill? Hold on. You don't have a $50,000 bill. $5,000 in my own bank. Absolutely. Yeah, I wonder if a normal person can get a hold of a $5,000 bill. There's got to be a way to do it. I just have no idea what that way would be. Yeah. Now that you mention it, I kind of want to have one too. I think it'd be kind of cool. I mean, there's probably a lot of things you can buy with $5,000 would be dumber than just having a $5,000 bill. Go to an ATM, you'll get $5,000 worth of $20 bills. You'll get, can't do the math, 2,500 $20 bills? No, that can't be right. 250 $20 bills. Yeah. So 250 Jacksons equals 1 Madison. Okay. So that'll do it for tonight. Thanks for joining in the stream. We'll do numbers 45 and 46 next week. More Madison. We're going to have Madison for several more weeks, well into August, before we're done with Madison. So yeah, have a good weekend. I'll see you in a week.